Whitehead is my guest. He is the co-host of Unslaved, along along with Michael Tessarian. You guys get into some very interesting and I would say even esoteric issues on that show, where you talk about often the true motivations and forces behind major religions, as well as the occult, or what we euphemistically call the New Age, and some of the political forces that often operate in the world in an unseen way, sort of what might euphemistically be called the unseen hand. Now, you're a Canadian native. You made some interesting observations last time I spoke with you when I was a guest on your show about Canada and about present political situations as they apply to Canada. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Give me a little bit of a thumbnail with regard to changes in Canadian politics, particularly since the election in the 1970s of Pierre Elliott Trudeau.
Absolutely, Chuck. And first of all, thank you for having me on your show. It's a pleasure to have you as a guest on our Unslaved podcast, and I recommend your listeners go and check that out. It was a fantastic interview. So thank you for coming on. As for the Canadian situation right now, our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who is currently, virtue signaling his way across the media right now and is in league on paper with people like George Soros, who is an infamous globalist who is literally funding the extreme Marxist left-wing propaganda that is permeating the media, academia, and all of the fields in Canadian and American culture right now. So Trudeau is absolutely 100% aligned with the globalist policy. And why is that? Why are so many world leaders jumping on this bandwagon, even though there are many, many dissenters within Parliament here in Canada or Congress in the America, or many of the people that are voting for these politicians are not wanting to give up their national sovereignty, are not wanting to go with mass immigration, or not wanting to go with foreign offshore central banks run by private banking families that have no stake in the country. So if we go back to 1974 with Pierre Elliott Trudeau, just a little side note, Pierre Elliott Trudeau was a staunch supporter of communism and socialism. He went around and visited the world leaders at the time, the Mao Zedongs of the world and the Che Guevara's and all these people. He was fans of these people, and he was actually trying to think about what's the best way we can pull the best parts. This is how he looked at it: the best parts of these regimes, without all the killing and all that kind of stuff, but just the best part. Bring it into Canadian politics and make it something that is a social utopia for everybody. And that's what started the chain. And a lot of people don't know that Pierre Elliott Trudeau, his wife, Margaret, I believe her name, Margaret Trudeau, yes. She comes from the St. Clair family. And the St. Clair family is a historic family that goes back to the Templars. When they came over to this area of the world, they were the first global banking, private banking cartel was the Templars. They had massive wealth. And even when the Templars got disbanded, their clerics, the people that were the monastic order of the Templars, went underground with this money and this cash. And they went and started throughout history. You can track this. You can see the foundation of some of these banks, like the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland, which is also has a lot of Nazi money in it after the fall of the Nazi Empire. And a lot of the same families that run those banks finance both sides of World War II. Just give some people some historical context, right? So they financed Winston Churchill on one side, and they also financed Adolf Hitler. So how the hell is that, rational?
Well, they profit from creating conflict between nations and selling arms, offering debt, debt service. Basically, these nations it has a lot to do with the lead up to World War I. Also, the nations went so into debt to private banking cartels and merchant banking houses. And the Sinclairs, of course, as you say, were a big one, even back in the American Revolution. That basically, in order to pay back the debt or in order to service the debt, these banks would draw these nations into conflicts. And, you have essentially this sort of what in the United States we euphemistically call the Eastern Seaboard liberal establishment, for lack of a better term. It's a combination of private merchant banking houses, huge multinational corporations, and sort of forming somewhat of an unholy alliance with the far left. And Pierre Trudeau seemed to represent that to a T. In a way, what he represented is similar to, at least from what you're describing, similar to what Mussolini was doing in Italy, in that he started out as a Bolshevik, as a very devout loyalist to the Leninist coup in Russia, but he came to realize that he would not be able to implement that in Italy because the Italians weren't ready for that. They were too much as small landowners and small businessmen, but also the Catholic Church had a lot of sway in Italy in terms of religious faith, putting aside the actual church itself. I mean, we're talking people who were believers in God and people who were religious. They were not likely to get swayed by an outright Bolshevik regime. So he came up with what he called the third way. He took elements of Bolshevism and he began to incorporate it into the Italian system as a way of moving the country in the direction of ultimately this sort of a world order, this ultra-socialistic entity. And, this is actually outlined in Marx's manifesto. One of the planks is that you adapt yourself to the local conditions of the society you're operating in, and you operate stealthily as a way to ultimately bring people into and nations into the fold. And it sounds like that exactly describes Pierre Elliott Trudeau.
Well, and you just said something there that we could use that word conspiracy, Chuck. And I know we'll get in trouble for using it because it's quite the word to use. But if you're teaming up with people to go against the law that is set in the nation, to subvert the law of the nation, behind the scenes, you're teaming up with that's a conspiracy. And yet we can't really use that term today because it's just been thrown around too much and too much baggage is with it. But yes, you're right. And in 1974, Pierre Elliott Trudeau was in power when the choice was made to take the Canadian bank, right? So we had the Bank of Canada. This is our own bank that was run for the people, by the people and all that. And all of a sudden now it gets owned by the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland. And
that's
now
incredible.
So our money is a debt-based system, just like the Federal Reserve System in America. It's the same thing. And we've seen a steady increase in debt, up to the billions of dollars, more than that. And there's been estimations to show that right from 1974, like Canadian economy was doing well. The average person, middle-class person in Canada was extremely well off compared to the rest of the world. We had a lot of wealth in our hands. We had a lot of lumber and water and resources and a thriving economy. And then you see it's just spiking down gradually as you see 1974 take place and we go into this globalist economy. So that was what laid the ground back then for Canada to now be no longer a national entity in a financial sense, but to essentially be at the whims of these globalist cartels.
First of all, I want to address the issue of conspiracies. I think that now that you have this crazy conspiracy by the establishment in this country, which is the sort of the Trump-Russia conspiracy theory, we can safely say that the left involves itself in conspiracy theories. And that one is like really concocted. I mean, they haven't have a shred of evidence after a year of pounding away day after day. We will never hear the end of it. Every day you hear them pounding off. And that's a conspiracy theory if there ever was one. But we're talking about, in this case, the change in the banking system. I think that the Bank of Canada, I don't know a lot about it, but I think it's similar to the original design of the Bank of the U.S. under the auspices of Alexander Hamilton. And even before that, in colonial Massachusetts, where I am, in Boston, we had a land bank. It was the first bank created by a colony in the world, and it existed entirely for the benefit of the people of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Right. It would charge a very tiny interest rate to farmers and small businessmen who would then have the money to invest in their enterprises, and that the interest would go toward building the infrastructure of the state. That was the model of the original Bank of the United States, but the Federal Reserve, as you point out, was an entirely different animal. It was controlled by a consortium of private bankers and investors, both domestic and international. And I think that seems to be what's happened in Canada. The bank has gone into the hands of, it's become a more private, if not an outright private institution, a for-profit institution that has a monopoly not only on the debt of the country, but it has, as in the case of the Federal Reserve, a monopoly on the issuance of currency. And that is a very powerful thing to have. I mean, the Constitution of I know that Canada, I don't think has a Constitution, but in the United States, the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 says that Congress is supposed to coin the money and regulate the value thereof, which means that Congress is the only entity that is empowered to create money for the American people. And that power has been transferred effectively to the Federal Reserve. And that's why our money now says Federal Reserve note. So it sounds to me like the same thing has happened in Canada. The result has been similar in that the country has gone into deep debt. The standard of living has dropped. Industry and business has been compromised, and sovereignty ultimately has been compromised.
Yes. And that's the big one. And you made a good point there about the comparison. The only difference I think with Canada, like we don't have a typical constitution, but we do have a charter of bill and like a charter of your bill and rights, right? Mm-hmm. And but the thing is we didn't secede from the Queen of England or the British standard as America did, right? We didn't fight a war of independence or anything like that. So essentially we're a British colony. Like I went to England and went down to Buckingham Palace, and you'll see all the monuments that are built to all of the lands that are owned by the Queen of England, overseen by her administrators. So we have a Secretary General in Canada. Everywhere here, especially I'm in the West Coast, so I'm technically a heretic talking about this, but because they glorify the royal family here and all of that. But the essential thing is that we're an ancillary of the Bank of England and the Queen of England and all of that. But if you really follow the dots, you've got the main banking houses in that London square mile. I think it's 386 of the world's mega
the city of London.
The city of London. It's its own jurisdiction, has its own courts, its own police. And I went down there, and you've got the Bank of England there, which the Bank of England was a key ingredient in financing Bolshevism, communism, and Nazism, right? So these bankers, even if people think that global central banking might be a good thing, which I would caution them on that, but even if you thought it was good, the people and the organizations that are lending money at us at compound interest, okay, it's like having a mortgage, right? So
that's right.
Your children's children will never pay it off. They own your country. Your government is in debt. Your government does not make the decisions. The people that own the debt of this nation make the decisions. Just think about that logically, right? And these groups, they have financed wars. They have stirred up wars. They have financed revolutions. They have financed all kinds of things. And now we've got even guys like George Soros and some of these cronies, the Rockefeller Institute and all that are financing protests and financing provocateurs and financing conspiracy within, essentially, because they have an ideology. They have an ideology, and that ideology is different than you or I's ideology, which is we just want the freedom and sovereignty to pursue our own interests rationally. We want to be able to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? The American dream.
Sure.
But they don't want that. They don't want you to be on an equal playing ground as them, because then too many independent agents would control resources, and they don't want that. They want a centrally controlled, central planned government. And where have we heard that before? Well, that's communist Russia. That's China. That's Venezuela. That's fascism. That's all of these things. And we in the show Unslaved, Michael and I have gone in depth, and we spoke with you about this too on the show, about the idea of collectivism as the overarching philosophy that is behind globalism. That is the same concept. And when you read a lot of the people, like you read the Aldous Huxley's and the you go back into Norman Montague, one of the chairman of the Bank of England, and then you look. Right. And then you even look into a lot of the people that are involved with the Bank of International Settlements and these globalist institutions. They are looking to set up a global state that we've always spoken about, the New World Order, the world government, whatever. It's got many names, but they've been talking about this for like over 100 years now, where they wanted to basically centralize power into small groups of hands. So you have an EU like in the European Union, you have a system based like the EU, but it's global. And you have bureaucratic, socialist / what they call super capitalist, and I'll get to that in a second, super capitalist power. So super capitalism is what we're talking about, private banking. So you could call it crony capitalism. It's not laissez-faire free market capitalism where there's a separation between government and banking in the same way we're supposed to have a separation between church and state, right? The idea is there shouldn't be any interfering influences on the market, whether it be the market of ideas or the market of goods and services. And when you set up a control system that's centrally planned, you dominate all of those areas and you can influence the tide of the social political array, right? And
That's right.
So this is the plan. This is the goal. And we used to talk about this behind closed doors, and people make fun of us. But this is mainstream news. I want to bring your listeners' attention to something that I just came across right now. For those that don't think they're trying to set up a world government, okay? There's something happening right now as we speak, Chuck. It's called the World Government Summit. And if you go to, I'll pull up the website for you. This is hot off the press. World Government Summit. Let me pull this up here. The worldgovernmentsummit.org. Okay. If you're listening right now, go to that website. I'm going to go there right now. I'm going to get to their agenda because it's going to link into what we're talking about here. And Canada's a big part of this, and so is America. But go and look at the partners. Who is partnering with this organization? Find out what the organization is. But here we go. The partnering organizations committed to shaping the future of the world, okay, are the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank Group, the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, and on we go. And then there's a ton of Arab, Dubai-based organizations as well. And we don't, Justin Trudeau here, just in a Canadian context, is super buddy-buddy with a lot of the oil partners in Dubai who are also trying to, there's a link there with the communist idea as well, which a lot of people don't know about. And Michael and I just did a show on the link. We called it Islamo-communism. We did that show. We talked about that. You were part of that. And that's something that a lot of people are not familiar with. And it's the merging of an ancient, old medieval mindset coming out of the Islamic world with a modernized view of communism. And this is one of the major reasons, nobody wants to talk about it, but it's one of the major reasons that Western nations, all at the same time, acting as if they're independently making this decision, they're all opening up the floodgates to mass immigration from the Middle East. And this is because the left, who is a representative of these globalists, they're not the left anymore. They are the globalist communist left, okay? They are now gathering the votes and support from those people. The policies that they want to institute will favor those people coming in, and they will not favor the native peoples of these Western nations and the ideas upon which America and Western freedom, as it's been conceived, stands for. So there's a lot going on here, and they are trying to implement a world control system. It's obvious. They're not lying about it. All the presidents and prime ministers are out there saying, we need world governance. We need a world government. We need world control. Even the Pope, we need a government that's going to glow. We need a world religion. So all these guys want the same thing. And I'm just shocked that we're still having this conversation with people as if it's not happening when it's on all the news headlines right now,
No, it's out there. The issue of, I mentioned when I was a broadcaster at Tufts University that I questioned whether or not it was a good idea for this country to allow mass Muslim immigration into the country. And for that, I was turned into the anti-bias police on the campus. I was attacked in an article, and then I was taken off the air. So obviously that's, a pretty hot issue to bring up. In the establishment. Now, when you talk about world order, we're not talking here, I don't think, it's certainly the impression I get is of like a formal one world government with that kind of a title. What the idea is to leave in place all the sovereign nations with their trappings and their local customs and their local rituals and their local, cultures. But in the de facto sense, power is transferred to this sort of amorphous, international, unelected, faceless series of bureaucracies like the UN and like all the rest of them, where the real power resides and where the average life of the citizen is manipulated. And when I say average life, it's very much, and as we talked about Islamofascism, it's very much why the left and why the internationalists resonate with Islamic extremism, with the concept of Sharia, which is the idea that the government or the rulers have an access to and control over the most intimate aspects of the lives of every single citizen. the family life, everything, you name it, marriage, business, whatever you do, whatever you turn, they believe that they have a right, a sovereign right, almost an enlightened right to manipulate those things and control those things because they're smarter than you. They know better than you how you should live. And it is completely anathema to and opposite to the American ideals, which are that rights come from the Creator and that the individual has a limited sovereignty under the Creator, and that the government is there to protect and defend that inherent and natural right. So, we are talking about two really diametrically opposed ideas here, and those guys have the high ground, both politically, culturally, economically. Now, David, I don't know if you saw this. I don't have the article right in front of me here, and you may know something about it, but there was just an interesting article that kind of flew out to me just the other day. The former defense minister of Canada, Hillier, I believe his name is. Hillier, thank you. He gave a speech where he said that, by name, that the world is being controlled by, quote, the Illuminati, unquote. Did you see it?
I did. And I'm actually friends with Paul. I've worked with him on and off for a few years now. I've been in his personally had a relationship with him. I've helped organize talks for him. His original platform when he came out in 2008 was he was exposing two things that he knew. Okay, he was first of all, for those that don't know about him, he's Canada's oldest living politician. So he's seen it all. He was serving under Pierre Elliott Trudeau as acting deputy prime minister of Canada. So if something ever happened to Pierre Trudeau, Paul Hillier would have been the prime minister at that time. Okay. He was also the former defense minister of Canada. So he was the one that unified the military here in Canada before they were separated. And then he came in and unified them so they could act more in concert and whatever. But anyways, he came out and said he was talking about economics, and he was explicitly talking about what I spoke to you about the Bank of Canada, 1974, what happened where these pirates came in and totally stole our wealth by taking it through debt, through this fiat currency system. And then he also wanted to talk about even some paranormal stuff. He had some ideas on this intelligence stuff going on with the UFOs. And that's what the media uses to try to slander him. He's a crazy UFO guy. But you should hear what he's got to say about it. But the main thing that interested me was his discussion about economics. And then when he's speaking about the Illuminati, the way he's talking about it is, the Illuminati is a buzzword that's going around and everybody talks about it and everybody's got their opinion about it. Michael and I speak about the actual historical group, the Illuminati, the Bavarian Illuminati, right? Mm-hmm. And it could be said that in the same way we were talking about the Knights Templar, how on the surface in the 1400s or whatever, they got exiled and assassinated. But then they went underground, and you see their symbolism in a lot of Masonic lodges all throughout Europe and all throughout history. And you see the exact same symbols and rituals from that. And you see that also in Nazism. You see it a lot in Bolshevism. And if you go to Russia, you've got the double-headed eagle, which is purely Masonic. So you see the symbolism there. And that symbolism is ancient religious symbolism that has been used by very, very elite families for thousands of years. Emperors, Roman family bloodlines. These aren't people that just woke up in the 19th or whatever century and started gaining wealth and then owning banks. They've passed wealth down through generations, and they have with them rites, rituals, customs, and ideologies. And those ideologies were also expressed by people like Adam Weishaupt and Loyola and all these people that were integral to this historically documented group called the Illuminati. And historically it was shown that, they went underground, they were disbanded, and they were never to be seen from again. Yet we have quotes from some of the highest ranking Freemasons in Europe, like the Duke of Brunswick, for example. So he was an aristocrat, he was an elite, and he was warning Masonry as a collective grouping that Masonry has been infiltrated through all the levels, all the ranks, and it's been infiltrated because of its compartmentalization structure, of where essentially knowledge can be given to the layman, and then it can be filtered and compartmentalized up through the fractal, just like the military, right? You're on a need-to-know basis. And he was worried about that. And he said, in his quote, he said, these groups that have been infiltrating Masonry are using Masonry to get into political office and get into our financial institutions. And they use ritualistic black magic. They use hypnotic techniques for mass mind control. And they remind me a lot of the Illuminati, if not the Illuminati itself. So there's been many of these little hidden sort of hints at these things. And someone like Paul Hellyer, he might not even be as educated on the subject of the Illuminati. But what he's really saying is it's a global cabal that has an agenda, that has an ancient ideology of this one world, Alexander the Great, we're going to make it perfect, globalist utopian vision. And they're willing to have casualties on the road to getting that. They are willing to have collateral damage, just like Lenin didn't mind it, Hitler didn't mind it, and any of these other dictators didn't mind it. If you want to use the Illuminati as the term, fine. But if people kind of cringe at that because it's a little bit too conspiratorial for them, just remember that we're dealing with elite, highly influential, extremely wealthy, like beyond imagination wealthy. These guys print money, as you said. They don't need money. And they have a religion that is not known publicly to the masses of people. We know about Islam. We know about Christianity. We know about Judaism and Buddhism and all these things. But do we know that at the highest levels of these religious institutions, that these groups all shake hands to each other? So the Vatican is shaking its hand with the guys over in the Middle East, right? The Muslim Brotherhood and all these guys, you know, through the Jesuits and all these institutions. We have the handshaking that goes on between Catholicism and Protestantism, which would wake up your average Irish person that would say, what are you talking about? They're antithetically opposed to each other. No, go check the symbolism. Go look at the manuscripts. These people meet in secret to make it seem like they're fighting. But the whole point is to use things like religion and politics and finance as a method of gaining power and control. And that's the simplest we can get it. It's greed, but greed mixed with sociopathy and power. And when you combine those two things, call it the Illuminati, call it the builder, call it whatever you want. We're dealing with a criminal gang of elite people that have a lot of power and wealth.
Well, I mean, first of all, the Illuminati is a historic fact. It's an accepted, standardized history in Europe, not so much in the United States. But the ideals of the Illuminati as set up by Adam Weishaupt, who was a professor of canon law at Ingolstadt University in Munich, and which was established May 1st, 1776, which, of course, is also the Communist May Day, and which is a big occult day as well. It's a big ritual day for, various secret, Satanism and Rosicrucians and other groups going all the way back probably to ancient times. And their idea was to disintegrate government and faith and move toward a world order. I don't even think that's controversial. That's exactly what they were about. Weishaupt, after they were exposed and kicked out of Bavaria, he got sponsorship by another German prince. I think it was Prince Theodore of Hesse-Kassel or another principality, where he lived until 1830. He published other books. There were two books that came out around that time, Abbe Baruel, his Roots of Jacobinism, and also Professor Robeson of Scotland came out with a book called Proofs of a Conspiracy, both of whom claimed and presented evidence that the Illuminati, and they get into the methodologies of the Illuminati, that they led to the French Revolution and to the Jacobinism that led to the Reign of Terror and the first communist takeover in modern times. I mean, maybe unfortunately, and those two authors might have been a part of it because their work has often been used by the conspirators to look at how to organize conspiracy. Karl Marx, 1848, was hired by the shadowy group called the League of the Just. Who knows who they were? Only 10 years after the death of Weishaupt, to write the Communist Manifesto. The group changed its name to the Communist League. Right. So, we could, it's not relevant whether or not there's an actual lineage here. Professor Anthony Sutton of the Stanford Institute has done some very good work showing links between the Illuminati and the Skull and Bones Society at Yale. Which
that'd be like a modern incarnation, really, of the same ancient rituals that were used by these groups, for sure.
That's right. Whether or not they actually were consciously members that passed it on, I mean, I personally think that they probably were, but it's not relevant. I mean, I don't want to be criticized for that. I mean, because I don't know. None of us do for sure. So we can at least say with good solid certainty that the philosophy, the tactics, and the politics that was first articulated in modern times by Adam Weishaupt has passed on. And you mentioned the Duke of Brunswick exposing the infiltration of the Illuminati into Masonic lodges. George Washington, you know about his famous letter, right?
It's so funny. I pulled up his quote, man, because you mentioned Jacobinism, which is the same thing. And he says, "It is not my intention to doubt that the doctrine of the Illuminati and the principles of Jacobinism had not spread in the United States. On the contrary, no one is more satisfied of that fact than I am." And he would know because on his gravesite, apparently he's a Mason. He would know he's in the know. And he was one of the original presidents of the founding fathers of the United States. And yet, would anybody today call him a conspiracy theorist?
Well, I mean, the first third party in the United States was the anti-Masons. And one of the major figures in that was John Quincy Adams, and some of his writings on this are unbelievable. So, you have in America a tradition of distrust for secret societies, and part of that not only is because they have an unfair advantage since they operate in secret, and there's obviously a temptation toward corruption, at least on the surface, but because they take these oaths that, if you look at them, Reverend Charles Finney published the oath to the Masons at the time of the formation of the Anti-Masonic League. And they're horrible. I mean, it's like, we're going to cut your bowels out and bury you in a shallow grave by the sea. And it goes on and on and on. If you in any way betray the trust or show any disloyalty to our group. Now, my question to listeners here is, how do we expect someone who takes an oath of office to be loyal to the U.S. Constitution? I mean, if they're a member of one of these groups, really, who are they loyal to? In a way, they already had pledged their absolute loyalty to the point of having their heads chopped off to this other external, unaccountable, unknown group of people. And I think that Americans have always had a distrust, therefore, of people in these groups, and for good reason.
For very good reason. And you bring up a very good point. And there's the book that you mentioned. I want to check it out. I'm very interested in that. But the idea that America is new to this idea of secret societies and these fraternal orders and these kinds of things, and that they actually have power and influence. See, when you speak to European scholars about this, and I've interviewed many of them, I've been to Europe, we've gone to Ireland, and your average person over there you're speaking to doesn't know the whole story, but will tell you, yeah, we know, the Orangemen and the IRA and all of that are all set up and financed by Masonic lodges. The symbolism's everywhere. The history's blatant. And when actually that's Michael's story, is that he was researching these organizations back in Europe. And when he came over to America and met up with guys like Jordan Maxwell and so many of these other American researchers, Gilbert Griffin and all these guys, they were looking into it they were new to the subject from an American perspective, because Americans got to that point where they were thinking, well, we're the most free nation in the world. We would never get infiltrated like that. But we know that, for the average American that can't buy into some, fraternal secret society taking power in America behind the scenes, how about just what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union? How about that? Or Operation Paperclip after Nazi Germany was taken down, where they brought in the top Nazi scientists and thinkers and philosophers into America and other places, Canada as well. And so we had extreme fascism and Nazism as an ideology infesting the West. And we also had communist defectors coming in. And there's a lot to get into about that. You cover that more brilliant than I could, Chuck, about the communist infiltration. But if we keep going beyond the idea of communism, just as the commies are here, the Reds are here, and go, well, who financed it? Why are they financing both sides of this? And the people that are really pushing this forward and changing the destiny of these nations, what do they believe in? And where do they come from? Well, these elites come from these skull and bones organizations out of these universities. They come from organizations like the Fabian Society Network, which its own symbol is a wolf in sheep's clothing. I mean, that's right. If you and I wanted to start a business and we decided, well, what would our logo be? What would be a good logo? Hey, let's go with a wolf in sheep's clothing. Like, why would we do that? If not, we're trying to say something, Right. And then so you got guys like Sidney Webb, one of the founding members of the Fabian Society, who says things like, to play those millions of minds, to watch them slowly respond to an unseen stimulus, to guide their aspirations without their knowledge. All of this, whether in high capacities or in humble, is a big and endless game of chess of ever extraordinary excitement. And if you think about that concept of chess, Go and read Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard. And you can see that many of the Middle Eastern nations that they hit and infiltrated and woke up, an old beast over in the Middle East and are in league with some of these high level Masonic orders that are in the Middle East as well, the Muslim Brotherhoods and all that. And they were making pacts with these people, and they want a chess. It's a global geopolitical chess game that's happening. So it's incredible to think now that we used to not be able to be heard about this for the longest time. But now, ever since Trump got elected, and he brought up in a very topical way, he brought up a lot of these issues. Like there's an issue with the media. There's a bias in the media. There's an issue, we got to drain the swamp. There's a lot of corruption in Congress and all this. And we've got way too much immigration and we can't handle it. And all like those issues he brought up just woke up again, the shadow government. Well, now they call it, we would say, the shadow government, but now they say deep state. Oh, the deep state. Exactly. It sounds more academic. You know what I mean? So fine. If you don't believe in the Illuminati, the deep state will do.
That's right. And no, look, first of all, I want to point out that I am generally an optimist when I look at these things, because I know that in spite of this enormous power that we're talking about, a power both political, economic, spiritual in the negative sense, and worldwide, they still don't win ultimately, and they still have not won, because what they represent runs against human nature, runs against human interest, runs against the individual. And so they are consistently checked and balanced and foiled, and that every generation since the days of Adam and Eve have had to deal with this quote unquote conspiracy, because they do operate in secret, and that to the degree that we can expose it and identify it is a degree by which we can keep it in check. It'll never go away. It's always going to be here because it represents the darker side of human nature. Now,
that's a good point. Yeah,
I just finished a manuscript called Assassination in America, where I look at 31 cases going all the way back to Alexander Hamilton, and I bring it up to today in the Clinton body count and other things, where there was a suspected assassination. It may be, may not be. I look at the conspiracy. I try to throw away the garbage and focus on what's real. And there's a lot of stuff out there that's not responsible. But I look at, as I say, I looked at 31 cases, and this conversation reminds me of one of the cases I write about, and that is Tim Russert. Now, Tim Russert was a generally liberal-leaning, maybe moderate, possibly even slightly conservative newsman in the mainstream. He was very well liked, very nice guy. He interviewed George Bush and John Kerry in 2004 for that election. And in those interviews on Face the Nation, where he was the host, he asked them about their membership in Skull and Bones.
Right, I remember this. I have, yeah.
And their reaction, both of them, it was really interesting to watch it. I think you probably could get it on YouTube. They both had almost the identical expression and facial movements. And they said almost the identical thing, which is, we don't discuss that. We can't discuss that. We're not going to talk about that.
And they made it look like a joke, like, oh, if I told you, I have to kill you. But like, they still didn't say anything about it.
That's right. And both of these men were members of Skull and Bones when they were at Yale.
That's right.
Now, Tim Russert died under mysterious circumstances about 3 years later. Now, there's no proof that he was assassinated, but, to me, it just was something that I looked into as one of my chapters. And I don't make any claims about it. I simply point out that there were a lot of coincidences around that. And I think that what happened with Tim Russert is I think he just stepped in it. He didn't realize what he was opening up with that one. He just was doing his job as a journalist and saying, hey, this is interesting. How do you explain this? And yet you're both, one of you is a Democrat, the other Republican. You're supposed to be opponents, but yet do you share like some kind of secret handshake, or what's going on here?
Yeah. It's so fascinating. And it makes me think, whenever I think about this, I've done a lot of study into criminology and the criminal psychology, right? I had a friend of mine when I was growing up who was in school. They wanted to be a criminal psychologist, and we used to talk about this stuff. And I just got into the subject, and you start looking around at gang activity. Okay. So in Canada, we deal with the Hells Angels, and there are many different gangs that are around here that, you just see remnants of their carnage. Okay. But when they want to take somebody out, it's on the street and then someone's buried in the woods or thrown off a bridge into the water or into the ocean or the lake or whatever. But it's the police do an investigation. They never fully draw the conclusion to the group, but everybody kind of knows who did it. When these very, very sophisticated types of people that are containing big secrets and are playing on the big stage, they're doing the same thing. If you look at it from just a psychological perspective, there's a criminal element within every side. Like we talk about this in a philosophical sense that we all have the capacity for good or evil. And if you're sophisticated and intelligent, you're not just going to walk around in the street like the Bloods and the Crips and battle it out. You're going to be very sophisticated, very methodical, and very strategic about how you gain power over territory and how you take out your opposition. And if like a gang wants to take over a neighborhood, they implement very specific strategies to do that, to take out the competing gangs. These guys aren't just taking over a neighborhood. They're taking over nations and the globe. They're taking over like world power and world control. So the average Joe can't imagine that. They're just trying to get their bills paid. They just want to live a simple life, have some kids, and have a decent retirement. But these elite people have been born into these families and then born into their ideologies. Just like these ISIS fighters and these extreme Muslim jihadists are raised in an ideology that supports their belief system, that leads them to commit these jihads. These people are raised in their ideologies and brought through their rites and rituals and trained in a very specific manner so that they can one day take power. And that's why in America, where you've got this free system to have anybody go and run for president, how come we get the same families in there? You get the Clintons and the Bushes and then even people like the Obamas that look like, oh, it's a black president that's outside of the cloth. Nope. Check again. He comes from the same cloth as all the other schmoes. So when Trump got elected, he was the first time in a long time that you had somebody outside of that cloth. And when I wasn't sure about Trump in the beginning, but when I started reading a lot of these globalist papers right away, their own, news articles and their own writings, and you hear what these George Soroses and what these, I can't think of the names right now, but what they said about it, they were freaking out that Trump might even have a chance.
Oh, yeah.
Because why? Why would that be a problem? Well, because they knew that Trump would have been a power. He was built in America. He raised himself up through the entrepreneurial system and the capitalist system in America, became very successful, and he was true blue American. Okay. And they knew that now they wouldn't have one of their agents in place to continue pushing this globalist ideology, which would have been Clinton. Of course it would have been. I mean, look at what Bill did, right?
The ultimate. Yeah. No, I mean, look, I think that Trump is all you say he is. I mean, I pray for his safety every day. It's incredible. I mean, it's almost a miracle to me that he won. And now that this whole conspiracy is coming out about how they created these phony dossiers and kind of spying on him with, stuff that would be, I mean, Nixon had to resign for a tiny tenth of this. It shows how much were determined to stop him and to try to throw him off center, and they still are.
Well, and if you say something long enough, just add that point, if you say something over and over again and you say it long enough in the media, even the smartest people will start to believe it. And what have they said since he got in office? Like nobody was calling Trump a misogynist, a racist, a bigot, whatever before he was the president, right? So that was their first tactic, was let's try to assassinate his character and make it look like he's this creepy friggin' whatever. But they kept falling on their sword again and again. The average citizen watching this and the average Canadian that might be listening to this going, what, Dave, you're supporting Trump? Listen, you hear the headline and the little side clip that is set up for you about the situation, okay? And then you don't go back and check it again as the movement of what's going on continues. So you've just sort of formulated your opinion based on a couple little tidbits of facts that were purposely put in front of you. And you got to ask yourself the question, is there truth behind that? Or let's go investigate further to see if there's something else going on. And when you go watch the full speech, or you read what people are really saying, or you see what the policy's really saying, like when he did the tax bill and all that, and you read what it really says, you realize the media is lying. They're not just making a mistake or just kind of slanting it. They're lying about it. And when I see them lying, I'm going, well, there must be something good here, because if the media is attacking him so much like this, then I'm going to cheer for whoever the media attacks. I'll be honest with you.
No, me too. And the whole business of him having something against black men and women or whatever, that's so obviously a piece of left-wing agitprop. One of your Canadian co-citizens, Jordan Peterson, I don't know if you follow his
I do.
his work, brilliant man,
Yeah.
Great stuff. He had an interesting observation about the way society and the way all of us are moving in the direction of reaction to stimuli. In other words, when we hear certain words, the word might be Trump or immigration or whatever it is, it's like we're not thinking any longer. I mean, this is obviously a part of human nature somewhat, but it's becoming accentuated by our media age with the drumbeat and with the constant barrage of information that it goes to like a very unintellectual shorthand in that we react to these things. And we've incorporated or internalized certain ideas that are associated with them. It's like a bookmark. A little bell goes off when you hear these words, and you're not actually thinking about, well, what about it? What about immigration? You know, why do I think this about Donald Trump? And what about the tax policy? You know, that's gone. Well, it's not gone, but it's reduced. And that we're becoming a reactive peoples and a reactive society to news. And I think that the media, this is part of maybe what you were talking about earlier with this sort of hypnotic approach and these methodologies of getting people to engage in groupthink and to operate based on emotion rather than reason and rather than the development of cognitive thinking, which of course is a big subject. We could get into it another time. What education has done, I've done many shows on that with the late Sam Blumenfeld, who's written some brilliant books on the topic. Yeah. I want to just touch upon two more things because we're kind of running toward the end of the show. The first, I'm asking you as someone who's been a close observer of Canadian politics, what was going on, maybe it was probably 10 years ago now, maybe 15 years ago, with the whole business of Quebec separatism? I always got the sense that that was a conspiracy to tear Canada apart, and that the people of Quebec and that the people of English Canada really didn't want that. You know, they really, there's a good deal of affinity in keeping the nation together, but there was something going on there which I think was an agenda to tear Canada apart by people who really didn't have the interests of either side at heart. What are your observations on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. And I've heard both sides. I've heard people say that it was a conspiracy to tear Canada apart. And I've heard people say that Quebec, some of the groups in Quebec were seeing the direction that Canada was going, which was way more globalism and all that kind of stuff. And they were trying to separate in the same way that, Britain wanted to separate from the EU. So I've heard it from both sides. But there's some interesting things. There was a protest in Montebello, Quebec, about some of these types of policies and certain groups meeting together. And the Quebec police was actually caught provocateuring the crowds that were protesting the meeting of this global stuff. And it did have to do with this. Did have something to do with another referendum coming out where Quebec was going to separate. And so there were police agents identified. It came out in the media. It was a big scandal where they were actually trying to incite violence to discredit these protesters. Now, I'm not a person that believes that going out and protesting with signs is effective, but it just kind of shows you the lengths that these groups will go to protect their goals. And there's also competing ideologies there. I think that it would have torn Canada apart, and I don't believe Quebec by itself would have survived. They benefit tremendously from being a part of Canada, but in a way, part of me understands the average Quebecer who might not be fully educated on it, but just feels like, well, we feel like Canada's led astray and we don't want to go along with a lot of their policies, and we want to have our own identity and our own cultural identity as French Canadians. And we don't want to be French Canadians. We just want to be Quebecois, right? And I can understand that sentiment. But as all these things, Chuck, and as you know full well, these types of revolutions get fomented and pushed and financed not to achieve the aim that the average good-willing or well-intentioned person might be going for, but they get financed to achieve a bigger agenda. So during those back and forths, more power was taken by the federal government in Quebec during that entire thing. So at the end of the day, the federal government wins. And it's set up kind of like the federal government system in America. Although we do have our differences here, but like I would say we're far more socialist than America is. I mean, America's going well into that, but Canada's even worse. And the more that there's resistance to that of any kind, the more they take and the more control they take. So that's how I've seen the outcome of that by and large.
So then the regardless of the sentiments involved, the result was that the Canadian federal government consolidated more power as a result of the crisis, maybe in a similar way that the U.S. federal government became more powerful after the Civil War.
It's exactly.
There's part of that. Now, I want to ask you about something that is a very unpleasant subject. That is, I have to ask it because it's in the news. This shooting in Florida yesterday, where this guy went in with a machine gun and murdered 17 people in a high school. Like everyone else, I'm trying to get my mind around this. I mean, how this phenomena is occurring. It's not new, but it is relatively new in this country. It really goes back to the Columbine killing, in Colorado, which was 18 years ago. And I want to know what you think is going on there. I understand that people can get angry, and in the old days, you'd have an incident or two. Before Columbine, there was one incident, and that was at the University of Texas, where this guy climbed on top of the tower and he started shooting people below. And it turned out that he had some kind of a brain tumor. So we know there was something really going on there. But what is this about, do you think? Well, why is society, or why are we producing people who are now going in and just shooting up rooms of people?
Yeah, we could do a whole show on this, Chuck. I mean, I think that there's a few factors at play. If you put aside the idea that this was some kind of Manchurian Candidate conspiracy type of thing, just think of it like if this is what they're saying it is, and I'm new to this. I mean, this has just happened yesterday, but these types of shootings are now a regular thing. It's almost like we're not surprised anymore that these shootings, ever since Vegas and all these shootings at the church that took place in Texas and all this stuff, let alone school shootings. A lot of these shooters are shown afterwards to have been on some kind of antidepressant medication or psychotropic drugs of some kind, which, they have homicidal and suicidal tendencies as the side effects of these drugs. So you can kind of go after big pharma on that front. But the other thing is that look at our culture. The young men and women today, as Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot, they're missing essential ingredients for growth. And it's like what Krishnamurti used to say, it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. So if our society doesn't have a cultural, strong root, and it doesn't have a direction for these young men and women to go into, especially these young males, typically these shootings are predominantly, young males. If there's no direction to go and they start to get fueled by certain ideas, and then you mix that with some of these drugs, it can turn into these kinds of incidents that happen. So it's repression. And from the perspective of psychology, the more that there is this psychological repression, especially at the adolescent stage of development, the more we see a leaning towards criminal behavior or suicidal behavior. Or like if you look at the suicide rate, that'll tell you one story. And then you look at the homicide rate and you see that basically they're in the same sort of situation mentally, where either I'm going to kill myself or I'm going to take everybody out in a blaze of glory with me. And it's a fine line between that. And so there are many mechanisms. I would look at a lot of environmental factors, looking at, again, the fact that, like, look at the culture coming out of Hollywood and the media with a lot of these young kids. And most of the music videos and pop stars today are putting all kinds of sort of gang mentality into a lot of the youth. It's cool to be, a gang member hanging with a Glock on your hip and all that kind of stuff. It's the shooting, the video games, the movies, everything is just seeped in violence constantly. And if you already have lost your self-identity and you're essentially becoming violent towards yourself, then it's quite easy for them to get to that point where they break down and go, screw it, I'm just going to go and take it out on the world. And, it's kind of funny. We're talking about these global sociopaths. In a way, they're operating on a different frequency with the same idea, where they're like, we're going to take the world where we want, we're going to make the world in our image. That's what we want. And if there's something wrong up here, and there's something wrong with their ideology, they're going to carry that out. Well, think of that on an individual level with these shootings. It's the same thing, just done in an extreme, adolescent, very immature way. And then let's not forget that whether it's actually planned and set up, or whether it's just used as an opportunity, then the media does what? Oh, well, nobody should have guns. We should disarm America. Mm-hmm. And that's where it always boils down to, doesn't it? Like after Vegas, they're like, okay, that's another reason we got to get rid of the guns. And we know that there's certain steps that have to be taken in America right now in order to achieve the full integration to the whole globalist village, right? So, I mean, there's so many factors that you could think of, but I think that, environment, the average psychology of your average teen today, the culture, the type of drugs, medication, even there's been studies to show that lack of nutrients has produced all kinds of forms of psychological malignancy. And so look at the food these guys are eating now. The nutrient deficiency is off the chart. I mean, we could go through a list of things that could be, but regardless, there absolutely is a big problem because, as you said, this wasn't happening before. Why is it happening now? Right. And there's a lot of questions we could get into there.
And I think you've done a very good job of outlining many of the issues. It should be looked at scientifically. We should look at it the same way you look at a plane crash. The FCC comes in and looks, what happened to this plane? Was it a design problem? Was it stress? What was it? And then you learn from the study and you make improvements. Anyways, David Whitehead's my guest. David, I want to thank you for joining me. Would you take a minute to let the viewers and listeners know how they can get more information about you and your work and your podcast and all the rest?
Absolutely. Well, Chuck, it's been a fabulous discussion, man. Great to chat with you. We're going to be in touch soon to have you back on again to Unslaved. For the Unslaved project, that's the project that I do as a partner with Michael Tessarian. You can reach us at unslaved.com, and all the links to our channels and everything is there. We're actually going to be running a 15-day trial for our premium content. So you can come and check that out and see what we got for you. For my own personal stuff, my website is wayofthetruthwarrior.com. I have my own personal podcast and my own sort of personal take on things. I deal a lot with the individual, personal empowerment, self-esteem. I'm a martial artist by trade, so I bring a lot of philosophy from the warrior tradition.
I can see that from the samurai sword.
Yeah, exactly. That's my defense system. But yeah, I talk a lot about that, but I talk about it from a philosophical angle for people that even if they don't train martial arts, it's the ultimate crash course in personal development, because I truly believe that, as you said, we're not up against something that's impossible to deal with. No problem that we've invented is something that we can't solve, but we got to resolve it on the individual level. We have to heal our bodies, heal our minds, and heal our communities and our families. And the way we do that is with strong, empowered people that are competent at what they're doing. So my job with the Way of the Truth Warrior and most of the work that I do is to try to give people resources and access to information that will help empower them on all of those fronts. So you can check me out at that website, wayofthetruthwarrior.com.
All right, David, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Chuck.
Soon.
Sounds good. Cheers.